Welcome to Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills. That's me. This evening we are interviewing Janet Hardy, the internationally famous and best-selling co-author of The Ethical Slut with Dossie Easton, considered the breakthrough book on polyamory, and many other books, including the recently released Notes of an Aging Pervert. Moment of Truth has covered the trans rights issue locally and nationally and encroaching Christo-fascist tentacles right here on the Central Coast, throughout California, and in both blue and red states. In our show, posted November 28th, rock stars for trans rights, former CBS correspondent and trans attorney Kristen Broud, reporter Aaron Reed, and California congressional candidate Maybe a Girl shared how accusations of pedophilia and child grooming, even of being demons, are used as propaganda in the current anti-LGBTQ plus crusades by Christian nationalists, groups like Moms for Liberty, and the GOP. Perhaps the antidote to all this gross dishonesty is honesty. Honesty about sex, gender, and sexual preferences as part of our human beingness. We hope Janet can help guide us toward a better understanding of all of this on this show. Before we get into it, however, we want to acknowledge that today is Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Our community here in Santa Cruz, California, has been through a lot of emotion, fear, and anger around the war in Israel and Gaza and over ceasefire resolutions at our County Board of Supervisors and especially at our City Council in Santa Cruz. This has now led to the use of King's legacy to both criticize protesters for a ceasefire and to support them. Tomorrow evening, Tuesday the 16th at 5 p.m., the Watsonville City Council will vote on a ceasefire resolution, and we will cover all of these ceasefire efforts, the response, and aftermath on a special Moment of Truth produced Talk of the Bay News Hour tomorrow here on KSQD at 5 p.m. Our special guest tomorrow is Dr. Izzeldin Abuelaish, a Palestinian Nobel Peace Prize nominee and author of the book I Shall Not Hate. Dr. Abuelaish lost 3 daughters and 1 niece to Israeli tank fire in 2009 in the Gaza Strip and has recently lost 22 other family members in Gaza. Still, Dr. Abuelaish believes that peace and understanding our shared humanity is possible. And now on to our special guest for this evening, Janet Hardy. Janet, I just want to make sure that you are with us. Are you with us?
I believe I am.
You are. I can hear you. It's a miracle.
It's a little complicated today. But yes, I think I'm here.
Oh, it's great that we made it happen. I know that you are somehow stuck in LA. We'll get to that, but I want to introduce you first. For those, for those who don't know who you are, Janet W. Hardy is the author or co-author of more than a dozen groundbreaking books about relationships and sexuality, including The Ethical Slut, which has sold more than 300,000 copies to date. She spent the first 3 decades of her life believing that she was the only person in the world who got turned on by thinking about spanking. She wrote her first book, The Sexually Dominant Woman, to help create a world in which nobody else would ever be that clueless. Janet has traveled the world as a speaker and teacher on topics ranging from ethical multi-partner relationships to erotic spanking and beyond. She has appeared in documentary films, television shows, and more podcasts and radio shows than she can count. And now one more. She has narrated audio versions of many of her books and looks forward to doing more. Janet spent a quarter-century as editor-in-chief of Greenery Press, the firm she founded in 1992, which went on to publish dozens of books about alternative sexuality and relationships. While she has retired from being a publisher, she goes on writing, drawing, editing, and educating about sexuality. Janet lives the life of a kinky poly-queer gender-bent geezer in Eugene, Oregon, with her spouse and a whole lot of pets. Welcome, Janet.
Hello. Good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you, too. Now, I know that you have a lot of fans throughout the world. I really appreciate that you have somehow found a spot, I guess, in L.A. Is that where you are?
I'm in Long Beach, California.
Oh, you live in Eugene, and it's like the polar ice cap in Eugene right now.
Eugene is a big sheet of ice right now. And even if I could get home on the airplane, I don't think I could get home from the airport. So
gosh.
I'm here until things warm up a bit.
Yeah, that's unusual for Eugene, isn't it? Because I grew up in Eugene, actually.
Oh, did you? Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's in the last few years we're seeing more of it, of course, because weather is getting more extreme everywhere. And, I'm getting calls from my spouse who's still up there about things going down, electricity flickering and the boiler having trouble keeping up with the temperature in the house and so on. So it's a good place not to be, but anyway, here I am.
Here you are.
Both of my sons live in Long Beach, and so I'm having some time with them and my grandson, and it's very, very nice.
That's great. Well, I want to just make a confession that I wasn't sure about this program because I'm not someone who's been terribly overly interested in polyamory. And but the more we talked about the interview with our team, the more interested I became. And then I went and got your book out of the library, The Ethical Slut. And I'm very aware that you've been on radio shows and podcasts. I think you said something like 1 million times in your most recent book.
That's slight exaggeration, but a lot of times.
Yeah, a lot of times. So some of this will really be covering some old ground for you, but I know also you might be seeing things in fresh ways. I just want to say that as I was reading the book, I started to feel like, everyone should just read this book, whether they're interested in an alternative sexual lifestyle or not.
We hear that a lot.
Yeah.
Really. And our answer, I'm speaking here for Dossie as well,
sure.
Is usually, if you go to the bookstore right now and you want a book about how to do monogamy, there will be shelves of them. We wanted to write a book that covered all the stuff that those books do not.
Right.
Because neither of us has been monogamous in a very long time. And at the time that we wrote The Ethical Slut, it first came out in 1997. It's been in 2 more editions since then. But back then, there was nothing. There was one book by Deborah Annapol, who's no longer with us, about how to do a particular form of multi-partner relationship, which is to say a marriage-like situation with more than 2 partners, with the expectation of lifelong monogamy and living under the same, or not monogamy, but fidelity and living under the same roof and all of that. And, that's a great way of being poly, but it's not the only way. And so we wanted something that covered a lot more ways of connecting than that one.
Yeah. And I think that's, what's interesting about your book and what I appreciate so much about your book is that it's about freedom in general. It's about honesty in general. And the word ethical comes into play because it's about how to be true to yourself as well as to those people that you love. There are sections about just loving people. And what does it mean to love people? So it opens up all these questions in your mind, that you might not have thought about before. I'm going to just read from the beginning. I'm going to read a few little passages for folks who aren't familiar with this book so you get a sense of it, and then we'll move on to some questions. This is from page 2 of the edition that came out, I think, was it 3rd edition in 2017? This is page 2. As proud sluts, we believe that sex and sexual love are fundamental forces for good, activities with the potential to strengthen intimate bonds, enhance lives, open spiritual awareness, even change the world. Furthermore, we believe that every consensual, intimate relationship has these potentials and that any erotic pathway consciously chosen and mindfully followed can be a positive, creative force in the lives of individuals and their communities. That's like such a mind blower for people who aren't used to thinking about sexual relationships that way, and now that you've been reflecting on your life as you have been in your most recent book, Notes of an Aging Pervert, which I've also read just recently. Can you tell me more about how that looks to you now, in your life?
Well, of course, I've been through a lot of changes in the 20-some years since the first edition of The Ethical Slut. And if you've read Notes of an Aging Pervert, you know about some of this. But at the time that Dossie and I were researching our book, Radical Ecstasy, which is about ecstatic practice during BDSM, I had
Wait. Tell people what BDSM is, because I don't know if everybody would know.
Fair enough. It is a portmanteau of bondage and discipline, dominance and submission, and sadomasochism.
Gotcha. Okay.
So it's what we used to call SM, and then the people who were into things that were not sensation play wanted more inclusion, so it has morphed into BDSM. And these days it seems to be being shorthanded a lot to kink. So whatever you want to call it.
Right.
we all have different names. But anyway, while we were working on Radical Ecstasy, I had an absolutely transcendent experience that was both thrilling and frightening, and which fundamentally changed my world in a whole lot of ways. One of which is that I don't do what most people would recognize as sex anymore. It's been a long time. And at first, coming out about that, which I did in an article in Salon, probably 10, 12 years ago now. That was the hardest coming out I've ever done, and I've had quite a few at this point. I was afraid I was going to lose my career, the sex educator who doesn't have sex. But a lot of people have been really interested in that journey because there's not much support given for people who are sex positive, but for whatever reason are not having genital sex. And so having me speak up about that has been a freeing thing for a lot of people. So, to make a long story short, I moved to Eugene from the Bay Area. My spouse, Edward, is also someone who has had a long and complicated sexual history, in addition to some physiological issues that preclude a lot of what might have been sex for him. And there we are. We're living together as a couple of old, weird, gender-bent geezers and having a lot of fun, but not having sexual fun. I still do BDSM scenes occasionally, only with people that I already know and love. But that part of my journey seems to be mostly done, and I'm okay with that. Mm-hmm. It can just be kind of the fact that it's taking me several minutes to explain this is because it's complicated.
Yeah. We are talking to Janet Hardy, the co-author of The Ethical Slut, with Dossie Easton, and I keep mentioning Dossie Easton because I feel like you might want me to. Actually, she's been a key figure in your life. Yeah. And also the most recent author of Notes of an Aging Pervert. I'm going to go ahead and read because it struck me too. I was reading Notes of an Aging Pervert, and in the very beginning you talk about, I'm not really having sex, and I haven't in a long time, except very, very occasionally. And then you get to page 82, where you talk about going to, I think it was like a tantric sex workshop, and you were doing an exercise in that workshop. And then here's the description of what happened. With Dossie riding across my hips, unable to get clear in time, I arched up like a dying bug, our combined weight borne only on my head and feet. If you offered me $1 million to do that right now, I wouldn't be able to. My fists started pounding the floor. I began to scream and kept screaming uncontrollably as the power surged through me. My intellect was still functioning, but it became small, distant, and helpless. It told me that what I was feeling was dangerous, that if it went on, I would hurt my body or my brain or both. I thought about strokes. I thought about heart attacks. What I couldn't think about was what might happen next because I didn't know. I'd spent many hours learning how to achieve this ecstasy, but it had never occurred to anyone to talk about how to stop. Maybe when it stopped was when I fainted or died. I mean, this is quite, I didn't know this was possible. I think a lot of people would not know. It sounds like an extended orgasm experience that went through your whole body. Or you're describing it here, but how would you describe it for us now?
Well, Tantra folks would call it a Kundalini awakening.
Okay.
And it's a thing that happens, and it is a life changer. I was at one point part of a podcast that I was doing with two other women in Eugene, and we had a guest on, Isis Lior, who was also a veteran of Kundalini awakening, and she was the one who taught me there was a name for it, which so many times in your life when you think you're the only one, you hear that there's a name for what happened, and all of a sudden you go, oh, it's not just me. And that gave me some ways to research it. It's basically an altered state, not unlike psychedelic experiences, which I've never had. In psychedelia, they would call it ego death. It's just a a moment when you're not you anymore. You're everything, all the energy flowing through yourself, and your sense of where you begin and end is gone. Dossie and I did the whole book, Radical Ecstasy, trying to find words for this kind of thing. And it's very difficult because English doesn't have very many words for this kind of thing. So I do my best by comparing it to other things. Orgasm is probably the closest that most people come. The best orgasm you've ever had, the one where you're utterly unself-conscious and unbounded, that's kind of what it feels like, but longer.
I mean, and then you go on to say that you started having orgasmic experiences all the time in exercise class while antiquing at the supermarket, and you could kind of control what you were showing to other people. This was happening everywhere. And part of me is like,
it was not a fun time.
Yeah, right. You're saying it sounds. Wait, did you say was not a fun time?
It was not a fun time.
Right. Like I'm reading it thinking, are people going to run to these, tantric sex classes now? Because it sounds like great. But then it says here in your book also, I haven't had genital sex in nearly 20 years. There are days when I miss it. But I love this sentence. I rushed all the way to the end of the line, and I'm pretty sure that journey is over.
Yeah, that is exactly it. I do not encourage people to go after this. Certainly not until you've had a lot of time in grade during doing lesser tantric or other ecstatic practice at a lower level. I think I tend to be a person who hurries toward things, and I write about that a lot in the book.
Yeah.
And I think I hurried too fast on this one. I was not ready. Dossie, who was there with me, had a great deal more grounding in this sort of activity than I had. And, she was very easy with the kinds of things that happen during intense tantric practice, and I am not. It was very hard for me.
Yeah.
So I jumped onto the advanced ski slope when I was should have been doing the bunny slopes. I say this as someone who has never had a ski on my foot in my life, so I'm sort of using somebody else's metaphor here.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, I went too far too fast, scared myself, spent some years recovering, and as I explained in the book, what finally helped me resolve it was when I started getting involved in the ecstatic dance community. Of course, I live in Eugene, which is a lovely town full of old hippies, and so we have a lot of ecstatic dance up there. Mm-hmm. And what it turned out to be for me was another embodied, transcendent practice that I could do at whatever level I wanted, and I could practice pulling energy up and pushing it back down again and moving it around. And, by the time I decided to let it out, everybody was jumping around and screaming and having a good time, so nobody noticed the old lady in the corner bellowing. And that kind of gave me a better framework for it and better control of it.
Yeah. And I just want to say about Notes of an Aging Pervert, this was the book that I read that helped me to connect with you as a human being. I mean, I haven't read all the books in between, in time for the radio show. Yeah. But it's really sort of amusing on getting older and on your history and on sex and sexuality, on appearance and aging. And so it's sort of very touching and invites us into your world in a very warm and welcoming way. But I want to get back to the book that sort of you broke out with, which was The Ethical Slut, co-authored with Dossie Easton. This is Janet Hardy, if anyone's just joining us. And part of me is like, I'm a little self-conscious because I haven't talked about these things on the radio before, right? And so I'm noticing my own hesitancy and like, what does this mean about me that I have Janet Hardy on the radio with me? What are people going to think? And so I want to go back to The Ethical Slut because what was beautiful about this book to me is the way you sort of open up, the parameters of life, not just sex for people. And I'm just going to read about this one paragraph here. Maybe you dream of maintaining several long-term sexual and intimate relationships. Maybe your dream is of a lot of friendships that may or may not include sex. Maybe the idea of genital sex holds no interest for you, but you still want to form a warm, loving partnership or 2 or 3. Maybe you want monogamy, but a kind of monogamy that you and your partner have created according to your own desires and not the blueprint handed down by the greater culture. And I have a feeling that there are, I'm just guessing at this, and you may know more and more people, and know younger generations are I think, more open to polyamory. And at the same time, when I mentioned that I was doing the show to people like, say, around the K-Squid community, there was an immediate recoil as well from older people who had been through like the hippie days. You know, I grew up in communal housing in Eugene, Oregon, actually. And
I see. You're not alone in that.
Yeah, and so actually, you know, there was a lot of sexuality at that time in the adult, you know, scene around us kids. We thought it was gross, you know, but whatever. And it wasn't malicious. There was no abuse, right?
Yeah.
But people do think things about, you know, like one person said to me, well, I just don't believe people can't be jealous. I remember kind of living through that time in the 60s when everyone was swapping keys at house parties and going home with different partners and free love. Do you think that's a mythology too at this point, that we look back at that time and say, oh, that was a failure?
I do think it's a mythology. I want to address your acquaintance who says that they don't believe it can be done without jealousy. It often can't. Mm-hmm. The difference is that those of us who choose something besides monogamy, we expect there to be jealousy. We figure out ahead of time ways to deal with it. In no other part of our life do we expect to not have negative emotions sometimes. And jealousy, you know, it's a negative emotion and it sucks, and we understand that. But people who enter into any kind of open relationship or non-monogamous relationship just prepare for it in the same way that you prepare for grieving when you know someone who's sick, in the way that you prepare for fear when you're doing something challenging. And you do what has to be done to survive it, and it gets easier with practice, and you just move on. Jealousy is not the end of the world. It sucks.
Yeah.
But it's not the end of the world. And if it's important to you to have a lifestyle that isn't monogamous, then you find ways to deal.
Yeah. And okay, so do you think that this is a growing movement? Because I've heard that, and
yes, it is.
Okay,
unquestionably.
Yeah. Oh, it is. Okay.
Back in 1997, when we did the first edition of the book, our audiences, when we gave talks, were mostly either old hippies like us or sort of Ren Fair / science fiction. That particular, what would now be called geek culture. That was who we saw at our workshops. These days we see everybody. Mm-hmm. All different ages, all different races, all different classes. It is a much more widespread phenomenon than it was when we started out. We never expected the book to take off the way it has. Mm-hmm. We thought we were writing another weird little niche book for our weird little niche friends, and nobody was more surprised than us when it took off the way it did.
So, okay, I'm going to ask you some questions. I know you've heard these questions 1,000 times, but for the sake of our, greater Central Coast community and people who are new to all of this, I know that there's a line of thinking that if you're in a relationship, and this kind of makes sense to me, this one person maybe can't give you everything, and this one person in a monogamous relationship maybe can't give you the kind of sexuality that you are looking for, but maybe you love them, right? And maybe they love you. And so what has occurred to me is it a way of actually kind of like, for me, I was thinking it feels like it's a way to not necessarily dispose of people, just because you're not compatible that way. And I've also heard of situations where one person has a strong sex drive and the other doesn't. And so there's a desire on the part of one person to be polyamorous, whereas the other spouse or partner doesn't really want that, but then may go along with it. What do you think about that, about polyamory actually conserving relationships and when one person does and doesn't, those two different things, I guess?
Something I think about a lot is what would have become of my first marriage if we had had access to good poly information at the time.
Mm-hmm.
My ex-husband and I are still good friends. You know, we raised our kids together, first living together, and then later with joint physical and legal custody. We've been friends for many, many years. And I think that what broke us up was my desire to do what was then SM, what is now BDSM, and he just wasn't interested, and that's fine. Someone has to be vanilla, and he's it. But if we had had access to poly information, it's entirely possible we would have been able to work that out, where I had play partners and he maybe had one outside squeeze, because genital sex even back then was not all that interesting to me. Because, other than that, we were very compatible people. We were great co-parents. We have similar tastes in literature and movies and all of that. It could have worked, but we didn't know.
And what about the person? Sorry, did you want to continue?
No, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
What about if there's a person who's not that interested? Like, oh, well, okay, I guess. And, have you negotiated that in your workshops with partners who are like, I'm reluctant, but I also want to save this marriage. I want to be in this marriage, and I recognize the needs of this other person.
It's not one of the commoner patterns, but it does work. I think in the Ethical Slut, I updated an interview I had done with such a couple way back when we did the first edition in 1997, and they're still together. He is just not a highly sexual person, and she is, and they opened the relationship very cautiously. I believe at first their rule was only on Ren Fair weekends, and then it was all of Ren Fair, and then it was outside, and through the years they just kept unfolding different levels that worked for them, and they've raised 2 kids together. Last I heard, they were still together. It can work.
We are talking to Janet Hardy, the co-author of The Ethical Slut and recent author of Notes of an Aging Pervert. We will be right back after this short break.
Thinking how many times can you fall in love? How many loves make a life? How many times can you fall in love?
Welcome back to Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills. We have a very special guest with us this evening, the author and worldwide speaker of The Ethical Slut. Her name is Janet Hardy. She's the speaker. The book is called The Ethical Slut, and recent author of the book called Notes of an Aging Pervert. And Janet, I thought I wasn't going to have so much to talk with you about necessarily, because this hasn't been a central focus of mine, but I have so many questions for you now.
Okay.
And what about the idea of commitment? Like, does that negate it seems to me that you're saying this is not at cross purposes to
I don't think it is. Mm-hmm. I think what is it that we are committing to when we decide that someone is a person that we love? The commitment might be, I'm only ever going to have sex with you again, but it might also be, we will care for each other and take care of each other. We will share possessions. We will do our work together. Maybe we're creative partners like Dossie and me. There are so many different ways to have commitment, and narrowing it down to only being sexual or romantic with one person is just one possible way. But it's the only one that seems to be recognized by the greater culture.
And yet we also have within the greater culture people who are cheating on one another, people who are sexually abusing one another, people who are raping one another. And it's occurred to me, especially at this particular time when we have what I call Christo-fascism, Christo-nationalism rising in this nation, that if we had more freedom this way, perhaps we wouldn't have so much violence, that possibly comes from repression, that comes from patriarchy. And here's another quote from your book. When you sit down to write a book about sex, as we hope you one day will, you will discover that centuries of censorship have left us with very little adequate language with which to discuss the joys and occasional worries about sex. And then further down, our fondest utopian visions are that when sex and love and intimacy are truly free and seen as positive forces in our lives and in the world, we will be much more able to solve the problems of rape, sexual bullying, shaming, and repression. Indeed, we hope this book contributes to a world where you won't settle for anything less than love and freedom in your sex life. And I'm just wondering, because it's just as I'm watching, we've done several shows. We're sort of known for doing shows on Christo-fascism and Moms for Liberty. They're coming in and banning books. There's this transphobia going on. They want to take down the pride flags, and they're coming from a very patriarchal space, right?
Yes.
And it occurs to me well, we know a lot of these people are having sex. I mean, just in Florida, of course they're having sex, but in Florida, one of the founders of Moms for Liberty, which started in Florida, Bridget Ziegler, the wife of Christian Ziegler, was having a 3-way sexual relationship with a woman who was then allegedly raped by her husband, Christian Ziegler, Florida chair of the GOP. So yeah. I know you're tracking all of this on some level because you're an engaged and interested person. And so tell me how do you see the patriarchy here? I keep coming back to it must be that I hate to say it, it's not all men, but these men in power in religions want to control. What's going on from your view?
I think that type of person projects much worse stuff onto people like me than we could ever imagine. I think when they imagine people who do what I do, they project their worst impulses onto us, and they assume that if we are given freedom to do what we want, that we will do the same terrible things that they would like to do. I don't think that is true. I've been pretty untrammeled for most of my 68 years, and I haven't done anything terrible yet.
Yeah.
And I kind of wonder what the problem is with them.
What is the problem with them? That's what I want to know.
Self-hatred is a big part of the problem with them.
Right, and having the sexual impulse and then not being able to express it in an open way, correct? That's... Yes,
exactly. Feeling like they're broken because they want a kind of sex that they think their God is not okay with, whether it's with someone of their same gender or whether it is kinky sex like I like to have or whatever it is that they want. They're broken because they want it, and they turn that hatred inward, and it festers, and there you go.
And then there's all this projection. We've had Kristen Brown on our show. She's an amazing former CBS correspondent, current attorney based in Miami, a trans woman who keeps a website called whoismakingnews.com, where she tracks, because transgender people, drag queens, LGBTQ plus people are being accused by the Christian nationalists and the GOP right now. And we're going all the way to Steve Bannon and Donald Trump and people who are, about to try to run the country, right? Are saying that these people are horrible. Steve Bannon just called like all leftists like demons at the Turning Point conference. And where do you go from there when you're being called a demon, right? It's getting very deep into religious fundamentalism. And And on Kristen Brown's website, she goes through all the different people who've been accused of actual sex crimes who have, been booked at a police station. And it's really primarily the people who are abusing children and
Yes.
committing crimes of sexual abuse are usually someone you know in your family. And then the next highest profession is a teacher. The next highest profession is religious employment.
Yes.
Then police, then politicians, then doctors, pretty slim, and you can't even see the graph for transgender. It's so small. Drag queens, 0.
Yeah. The woman who used to babysit my younger son when he was too young to be left alone was a trans woman. And I think the most outrageous thing she did while she was with him was play chess with him. I did a drawing a while ago of the two of them playing chess. It's very cute.
I know, yeah. You have drawings in your book, too, I should say, and they're very sweet. You have your drawings of your friends and of yourself as an older person. And I'm going to get back to that book as well. I'd like to end on that book, but I just want to make sure that everyone knows that we are talking to Janet Hardy, co-author of The Ethical Slut, recent author of her new book, Notes of an Aging Pervert. Please call in if you would like to talk to Janet Hardy, 831-900-5773, 831-900-5773. You know the number. Don't call 800. That is actually like some kind of a sex chat. Or maybe go ahead and call the 800. But to reach the station, it's 831-900-5773. Email is on air at ksqd.org. Going back to Janet Hardy, I had this more sort of open-ended question for you. We were talking about Christofascism, Christo-nationalism, and just all the projection that's happening with, people having threesomes and sexual abuse within the church, within the clergy, and then accusing everyone else of all these horrible things. And so in some ways, I think this book is important politically, both of these books, because I think it's sort of like people need to realize that sex is a thing, right? It's a thing that we are part of. It's part of us as human beings. Mm-hmm. And the more we can talk about it with integrity, with ethics, which is what the Ethical Slut is about, because you talk about how to be honest with your partner and how to deal with your jealousy. In fact, there's this wonderful passage, let me see if I can find it really quickly here, where you talk about not just the myths of sexuality, but being a whole person. And I love this. We believe that the fundamental sexual unit is one person. Adding more people to that unit may be intimate, fun, and companionable, but does not complete anybody. The only thing in this world that you can control is yourself, your own reactions, desires, and behaviors. Thus, a fundamental step in ethical sluthood is to bring your locus of control into yourself, to recognize the difference between what is yours to control and what belongs to other people. With practice, you can become able to complete yourself. That's why we call this integrity. And I do feel like people may get scared off by this term BDSM or SM, but again, that's consensual, correct?
Absolutely.
Right.
If it's not consensual, it's not BDSM.
Right. And whose business is it, right? To decide what other people want to do for their sexual pleasure, as long as it's consensual and honest, basically. There were some other things I wanted to ask you about, but before I keep asking you questions, is there anything that because you've written these books, many books in between, and then you just finished Notes of an Aging Pervert, which is about death and dying and aging and, all those fun things, but from a very tender place. And is there anything that's been on your mind recently that you would like to share with our audience that is like something that keeps recurring to you since you've written and published that book?
I actually, a conversation I had last night with a woman friend who was telling, she comes from a family of born-again people, and she is not religious herself. And she was telling me how disturbed she was by seeing her mother speaking in tongues. and how that felt like an abandonment of self to watch for her. And certainly I can understand that in one's mother, that would be maybe a hard thing to see. But what I was trying to explain to her is that her mother and I are talking about the same experience. It's just she has an overlay of religion on it that I don't put on it. I think there is a fundamental human need to transcend, to step outside ego state. And we all, I think a lot of people do not find a way to do it. But those of us who have found a way to do it, it feels essential at that point to be able to get there when we want to. Because I don't think humans are designed to live 24/7 in ego state. Life in the 21st century is complicated enough that we need to most of the time. You know, you cannot figure out a bus schedule if you are in a transcendent state. It just doesn't work. But the desire remains there for many people, maybe most people. And I think, you know, if I could wave a wand and talk to all these Christian types who are depending on their churches to get them there, and to tell them that there's other ways to get there that you don't have to tithe 10% to do, I would. You know, I respect the desire to do it. I really do. I think it's important. Mm-hmm. But I wish that these people had better information about how to get there.
Now, but would you, because I was reading that this was one of the reasons that you got into BDSM is because you would sort of hit these states of mind where you were very present, and it was transcendent for you. It has been transcendent for you. Now, in my world experience, my personal experience in life, there are different ways to do that, right? You could be meditating, or you could be studying spirit. You could be doing, I mean, would you agree that there's different ways that people could do
Absolutely.
that? Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a marvelous book called Hurt So Good that is one woman's exploration of seeking extreme pain through various means. She does do sadomasochism, but she also does ultramarathoning. She's a ballet dancer, which God knows those people torment their bodies. She enters a hot pepper eating contest. She does, polar bear swimming. All these different ways of putting extreme stress on the body in order to achieve an altered state of consciousness. And it's really good. She's really upfront with her desires and her experiences. It was a delight to read. So
that's another route through physical pain, which is new to me in my, consciousness. That's not how I think about it. And what about, and it's fine. And what about other ways like...
They have, meditation, certainly, absolutely. Another book that was very useful to me when we were working on radical ecstasy is a book called there's actually two books with the same name, I'm sorry, but it's called Why God Won't Go Away, and it's an exploration of the neurophysiology of ecstatic experience. And what they found when they did brain scans of religious people in prayer and meditators doing intense meditation is that the pattern that they see in the brains is very similar to that of orgasm. The part of your brain that keeps you located in time and space goes quiet. And that's what it feels like when you're doing that, is time and space have become irrelevant, and you can't stay there for very long. At least I can't. But it's just a way of seeing what lies outside the part of your brain and body that keep you anchored in time and space. You get this momentary glimpse of what the universe actually is when you're not stuck in a body.
If you can believe it, we're talking to Janet Hardy, co-author of The Ethical Slut, and now we're talking about, enlightenment experiences or transcendent experiences. And Janet Hardy, there is a section in your book that relates directly to this, which is about the Oneida community. in rural Vermont. And Oneida, I mean, we know that name from, is it silverware or what is it?
Silverware, yes.
Okay.
Yes,
and
silverware.
so there was a community of people who actually, led by John Humphrey Noyes, was using, this was in the 1840s, was looking at sexuality as a way to be spiritual. Tell us more about that.
It's not my expertise. Dossie wrote that section.
Okay.
She did the homework on that one, so I'm not going to be able to give you much, but there are books. You could probably Wikipedia it and get a lot of information off of that. So I'm sorry, I can't be the one to give you a good answer on that.
Right, or you could read from page 81 in The Ethical Slut. And also...
One of the things we...
Go ahead.
One of the things we wanted to do in this edition of Slut, which is the third edition, was to have some information about some of our forebears, some of the other people who have explored sexual experience and group living and non-monogamy and free love and all the different factors that now seem unachievable in a monogamy-centrist culture, but actually have been achieved for any number of years by any number of people.
And, it says here, I get suspicious when there's a man in charge of some kind of any kind of poly community, because I have now watched probably like a dozen documentaries about cults that originated in the Mormon religion, for example, polygamous cults. And it's crazy, there's control, there's abuse, there's taking advantage of young 14-year-old, 12-year-old girls. But in this case, with the Oneidas, the community evolved an ethos of women's rights that was very advanced for its era. Efforts were made to ensure equality in work between men and women. And women cut their hair short and wore knee-length dresses with bloomers, giving them freedom of movement, et cetera, et cetera. So this sounds like more like kind of the real deal. And they worked to avoid what they called sticky love, by which they meant romance or falling in love in favor of communal love. That's an interesting idea, like that you could be in communal love rather than in this sort of interdependent unit of two.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
My personal belief is that humans are not meant to live in nuclear families. I'm staying right now with my sons. My older son is married and has a 3-year-old son. I was down here for the birthday party, and we just arranged to build an accessory dwelling unit in the backyard of his house so that my younger son can be here too and be part of their family. Because these people, I watch them and it breaks my heart. They both have jobs. They're trying to raise a child. They're trying to maintain a household. It can't be done. It needs outside help. And I see this so often these days with people who have been told that if they can't make the nuclear family work, it's because there's something wrong with them. No, it isn't. It's because there's something seriously wrong with the model.
Yeah.
I was telling my mother this once when she was alive, and she sort of bridled a bit and said, well, it worked okay when I was a child. And I said, Mom, you had servants. And that had never occurred to her, that was not a nuclear family when you have a live-in cook and housekeeper and a groundskeeper and driver person, which they did. And obviously this was an affluent lifestyle for its era, but it's also what used to shore up these things that we are now told are the natural family unit is two people. Also, working women were a lot rarer back then. So we had one man who was bringing home all the money, one woman who was playing golf mostly, as far as I can tell, and servants doing the rest. Uh-huh. And yet there are people who will tell us that nuclear family is the way we should all be living, and that there's something wrong with us if we can't make it work.
Yeah. I have this nostalgia for communal living because you live in Eugene, Oregon now, where it's the frozen tundra. Yeah. And I used to live in Eugene, not far from the university, up on Capitol Drive, up on the hill there. And we had like a communal household. There were students that lived there coming and going. My father made a point to get other single parents into that home. So I had a kind of like siblings, and it was tons of fun. Now, I want to say I had so much love. I had so much love in my life that really, I think, really formed me and helped me also gain a sense of acceptance for all kinds of different people and a sense of adventure, in life, because everybody was kind of a hippie at that time. Yeah. And so, then I think it's the word is kibbutzim, in Israel. And this is a hard thing to bring up because they were just brutally attacked, on October 7th. Some of these kibbutzim, a lot of them peace-loving communities. And in a kibbutz, I've been to some of these kibbutzes in Israel because I'm related to an Israeli person, and I've been to Israel maybe 4 or 5 times now. The children are raised like the parents drop the kids off at daycare, during the day, and they're all in this one community in a shared physical space, and then the parents go work, and then they have a big dinner in the communal cafeteria, and that does. It was a sort of a communist structure, actually. It's something that
absolutely.
Netanyahu and his government have really been moving away from, right, in favor of sort of a high-tech capitalist marketplace in Israel. But that seems like one structure that seems to work really well. Now, I don't know if you want to comment on any of that.
Well, my spouse is a former communard himself, and he refers to the kids he helped raise as his practice kids. And then he had a kid of his own later who now lives a few blocks from us. I truly think that the wiring in our heads is set up for that kind of an arrangement, that this nuclear family business is not what we are wired to do. Kurt Vonnegut wrote a wonderful essay about this, and I wish I had it in front of me, but I think what he said is that our brains are wired for us to live in small villages where we know everybody and love everybody, and we get angry every time the world proves to us that that's not the way we're living.
Yeah.
And I think that is true.
Yeah. Although there is this tendency for some people to kind of get sick of living with a whole bunch of people,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I've done group living, and what I find is I wind up being den mother, and I get resentful.
Yeah.
So, and that's on me. It's me not maintaining my boundaries well enough. But on the other hand, my spouse and I are on the waiting list now to move to a continuing care community. He's older than I am and has some significant disabilities, and we just need that kind of support. And that's another kind of communal living.
Yeah.
Where we'll be surrounded by people our own age and doing things with them.
Yeah.
And I think that will be a good thing for us as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that too. My grandmother lived in a place like that as well, and it was nice for her. We only have about 4 minutes left in the program, but I wanted to share, when I first opened your book, I thought, maybe you're, I think, 10 years older than me. I'm not sure from reading. I think so. And
I'll be 69 next month.
Okay, a little bit older. And I opened the book and I thought, it's like the AARP magazines my mom gives me, where I'm like, Mom, this is great, but I'm not ready. Like, I don't want to start reading all about prostate cancer and, email scams and things that older people are dealing with. And I thought, but I have to read it. And then I found it very endearing in the end. One thing that I want to share is that you went to UCSC, and I thought this was cute because you talk about your experience, where most people are like, oh my gosh, what a beautiful campus. And you write here, much of the campus was accessible only on foot, by bike, or via a system of trams I never really got the hang of. I hated long walks, especially on hills, and hadn't ridden a bicycle since I was 12. Hence, I missed more classes than I attended. I thought that was cute because we just love our UCSC campus here with all the deer and everything.
It is beautiful until you try to live on it.
And then
also, I will say that my freshman year at UCSC was the year that Edmund Kemper was doing his thing, and my fellow classmates were being found dismembered all over the campus.
Oh, no. Oh, he was a serial killer. Yeah, that's not good.
Yes, he was.
Oh, well, speaking of death and serial killers, this is going to be a weird tangent, but you talk about dying in your book, and I'm just going to read this one passage and let you comment that we're probably going to have to wrap up the show. You watched your father pass away through an assisted suicide situation that was all legal and actually seemed like a very good thing. Your mother, I think, did the same thing, and your pet was it your pet dog, Amy? Is that
yes? Yeah, Amy. Yes,
and which is my name. And then you write here, you've had these transcendent experiences, and you've left your body in those transcendent experiences through actually BDSM experiences or tantric experiences. And you write here, perhaps at the moment of dying, you stop, you cease, and then you decease, becoming something else that we cannot begin to imagine. Being deceased doesn't sound like too bad a deal to me. Janet Hardy, we have 30 seconds if you want to comment on that.
My brain keeps me stuck in space and time, and I'm looking forward to finding out what happens when it doesn't do that anymore.
Thank you so
Hopefully
much.
A few years in the future, because I have work I want to do, but still, it's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for being with us. What is your website, Janet?
It's kind of a long, I need to get a better one, but right now it's jhardyauthor.com.
jhardyauthor.com. Janet Hardy, author. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay, well, we'll just search her up. Put that in the search bar, and you'll find Janet Hardy, co-author of...
You can also see me on notesofanagingpervert.com.
And notesofanagingpervert.com. Thank you so much, Janet Hardy, for being with us on Moment of Truth. Our next Moment of Truth is our special episode for Talk of the Bay tomorrow with Nobel Peace Prize nominee and author of the book I Shall Not Hate, Palestinian doctor and peace activist Professor Izzeldin Abuleish. After that, that's tomorrow. And then after that, on the February 5th Monday, the world-famous master MAGA troller and social media sensation Walter Masterson. I'm sure you've seen him if you've been on Instagram or TikTok. Please contact the Moment of Truth team at amy@ksqd.org. That's AMI, ksqd.org, with questions or comments about our program. Amy's coaching and education website is at www.amychen.com. Moment of Truth gives many, many thanks to our team, Nyanko Nyasu, sound and tech engineer, and our research and production team, Nyanko, Mei-Ling Obinada, Todd Zimmerman, and Vara Ramakrishnan. Todd Zimmerman of Nativeverse Studios created the theme song. Kathy Krizik created our logo. Thanks to our KSQD program manager, Howard Feldstein, and the entire KSQD team on the California Central Coast where this show originates. Thank you for tuning in to Moment of Truth. And remember, if we don't use our democracy, we lose our democracy.